I need to tell you something I've never said out loud. Not to my sister, not to my therapist, not even to myself if I'm honest, not in these exact words. For months, there was a part of me that believed them. The part of me that heard, "You're unstable, you're forgetting things, you can't be trusted with your own daughter." And instead of getting angry, I went quiet. I started checking myself, watching myself, wondering if maybe I really was the broken one. No, that's not even right. I didn't wonder. I was almost convinced. I doubted my own mind before I ever let myself doubt him. That's where this starts, not with what he did, with what I let myself believe about me. I've never told another living soul. If you're willing to hear me out, hit subscribe. I need to get this off my chest. I met Corvin when I was 26, at a dinner I almost didn't go to. I remember that detail specifically, almost didn't go, because for years I treated it like proof, like the universe meant for this to happen. I don't believe that anymore, but I want you to understand how it felt at the start, because none of what comes later makes sense unless you know how good it felt first. He was still. That's the only word I have for it. Not quiet in a shy way. Still, like he didn't need to fill a room to belong in it. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. On our third date, he showed up with a book I'd mentioned once, in passing, weeks before, a specific edition. He'd driven across town to find it. I thought, this is a man who pays attention. I thought attention was the same thing as love. We married 2 years later. Iris came 3 years after that. And I want to tell you about her for a second, because she's the reason any of this matters. She had his eyes and my stubbornness, and a way of looking at you that felt older than her 4 years. She'd ask me things like whether clouds got lonely, and I'd have to stop whatever I was doing and give her a real answer. Because she deserved one. For a long stretch, we were good. I keep wanting to say that, full stop, no hedge, but I have to correct myself, because the honest version is, I thought we were good. He traveled constantly for work, infrastructure consulting, weeks at a time in cities I could barely picture. I was the one home. The pickups, the fevers, the 2 a.m. nightmares. That was the deal, I told myself. He provided, I nurtured. And somewhere underneath, that arrangement was supposed to be a partnership. Even on the nights it didn't feel like one. What I didn't look at, what I actively chose not to look at, was a distance growing between us that had nothing to do with his travel schedule. The way he'd come home, and I'd feel like I had to reintroduce myself. The way our conversation stopped going anywhere except logistics. Exhaustion, I called it. His and mine, both. Easier to name it that than to look any closer. I was so busy explaining the drift to myself that I never once asked what it might actually mean. There's a version of this I could tell you where I didn't notice anything was wrong until the day it all broke open. That would be easier. That would make me just a woman things happen to. But that's not true, and I promised myself I wouldn't do that here. I noticed months before any of it surfaced. Small things, the way he'd go quiet when I asked about a trip, the way certain weeks didn't line up between what he told me and what was on the calendar. And then I did something worse than ignoring it. I built a case against myself instead. Too sensitive lately, too tired to read him fairly. If something were really wrong, I told myself, I'd feel it more clearly, not realizing how backwards that was, using my own numbness as proof nothing was happening, when the numbness itself should have been the warning. Here's the part I'm least proud of. It wasn't naivety. Somewhere underneath it, I think I knew it was easier to believe I was failing than to believe he was lying. If I was the problem, I still had something to fix. I still had control. If he was the problem, if the man I built a life with was capable of that, I had no control at all. And some part of me would rather have carried the blame than face that kind of powerlessness. So I carried it. I apologized for things I hadn't done. I softened questions I should have asked directly. I made myself smaller so the marriage could stay the same size. That wasn't love. I need to be honest about that too. That was fear, wearing love's clothes. Have you ever convinced yourself you were the problem because it was easier than facing what someone else was doing to you? Tell me in the comments. I want to know I wasn't the only one. I want to tell you about the wine, because it's the smallest detail, and somehow it's the one that still gets me. I'd bought a bottle for a dinner we were planning. I remember buying it, remember exactly which cabinet I put it in. A week later, I went to get it, and it was gone. I asked Corvin, expecting him to say he'd used it for something. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Patient, careful, like he was choosing each word by hand. "Renata, we talked about this. You finished that bottle last Thursday, don't you remember?" I didn't remember, but he said it so plainly, so without any edge to it, that I thought, maybe I do. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I drank it on autopilot, and the memory never stuck. I want you to notice how fast I did that. How fast I handed him the truth and kept the doubt for myself. That was the first one. Over the next few months, more things started slipping. I'd bring up a conversation we'd had, something specific, something I could picture clearly, and he'd tell me, gently, that it never happened. I'd swear I sent an email and find no trace of it in my outbox. Small things, easy enough to write off as a bad memory, if you wanted to call it that instead of what it actually was. I started keeping a notebook, not because I suspected him. I want to be clear about that because it still embarrasses me, but because I was genuinely scared something was wrong with me. I wrote down conversations right after they happened, like evidence I might need later, except the case I was building was against myself. I looked up early onset memory conditions. I made a mental note to ask my doctor for a referral. I need you to sit with that for a second, the way I've had to. A grown woman, capable, careful with her own mind, convinced she might be losing it, because the person she trusted most kept telling her, softly, that she was. That's what it does to you. Not loud, not cruel sounding, just patient, repeated, until you can't tell the difference between his version of events and your own. I believed him over myself. That's the shame I carry from this part. Not that it happened to me, that I let it. He waited until Iris was at school. I've thought about that detail more than almost anything else in this story. How he planned the morning down to the hour, made sure she wouldn't be in the house, made sure it would just be the two of us and a folder he'd clearly been building for a long time. I was making coffee. He set the papers on the kitchen table, sat down across from me, folded his hands like he was about to deliver a eulogy and said, "I've been worried about you for a long time. I think you need help, and until you get it, I don't think Iris should be primarily in your care." A custody petition, detailed, specific, dates and times I was supposedly intoxicated in front of our daughter, days I supposedly failed to pick her up from school, an afternoon I supposedly left her unattended in the yard. There was even a written statement from our neighbor, a woman I considered a friend, describing a scene I had no memory of at all. I want to tell you I immediately knew it was a lie. I didn't. For one terrible second, standing there with my coffee going cold, I thought the same thing I'd been thinking for months. Maybe I really am losing my mind. Maybe this is what it looks like from the outside. And then something underneath the fear went very still, very clear, because I knew, not in my head, in my body, the way you know the sound of your own child's laugh, that I had not done those things. Not the drinking, not the pickup, not the yard. I knew it the way you know something true. And if I hadn't done them, then somebody had written a story where I had. That sentence changed everything. Not because it gave me an answer, because for the first time in months, I stopped looking at myself for the explanation and started looking at him. It took a piece of paper accusing me of being unfit to finally make me ask the question I should have asked a long time ago. Who benefits from me looking unstable? I called a lawyer that same afternoon. Her name was Philippa Osei, and she had this way of going completely quiet while she read something, which I learned meant she was paying full attention. When she finally looked up from the petition, her face told me everything before she said a single word. "Some of these dates don't add up," she said. "I want you to get a private investigator." I said no, not right away. I hedged, found a dozen reasons that sounded better than the truth. But the truth was, I didn't want to do it. It felt paranoid. It felt like something other people did, people whose marriages had already failed in ways mine hadn't. The real reason is simpler and uglier than paranoia, though. Hiring someone to follow my husband felt like admitting I'd already decided he was guilty. Some stubborn part of me was still trying to protect the man I'd married, the still careful one who drove across town for a book. I didn't want to be the woman who stopped believing in him. Even with his own custody petition sitting on my kitchen table, it took Philippa looking me dead in the eye and saying, "Renata, Either this happened and we need to understand why you don't remember it, or it didn't happen and someone manufactured it. Either way, you need facts, not feelings, before I finally said yes. I need to stop here for a second. If any part of this is sounding familiar to you, if you've ever protected someone past the point it made sense, take a breath with me. Then share this with someone who might need to hear it today. They might be sitting exactly where I was. I need you to brace yourself for what comes next, because I almost didn't believe it myself. 3 weeks later, Wendell called and said 4 words I still hear sometimes. I need you to come in. I sat across from him in his office. Gray carpet, a desk that needed dusting, nothing dramatic about the room at all, which somehow made what came next feel worse. He laid photographs out one at a time, like he was dealing cards, and didn't say anything until they were all on the table. Corvin, walking into our own home through the garage, on a day he'd told me he was in Cincinnati. The timestamp read 2:47 in the afternoon, a Tuesday. Iris was at school. I was out running errands, completely unaware that my husband was standing in our kitchen while I was 3 miles away buying groceries for a dinner he wasn't going to be at. Corvin, leaving 20 minutes later. Corvin, arriving at a storage unit a few miles from the house. And then a woman, coming out of that same unit an hour after he'd gone. Her name was Tatum Bryce. She'd worked for his firm, 32 years old. Wendell said it carefully, like he already knew the next sentence would land harder than the last one. She's not just someone he's seeing, she's been living a parallel life with him for close to 2 years. He's got an apartment in her name. He's got accounts you've never seen. He's been moving money for over a year before you ever saw those custody papers. I asked him what that meant, even though some part of me already knew. He was planning to leave, Wendell said. And he was planning to take Iris with him. He needed you to look unstable for that to work. I want to tell you, the room went quiet, but it didn't. I could still hear the hallway outside, somebody's phone ringing, completely ordinary sounds happening around the worst sentence anyone had ever said to me. And then the smaller pieces started falling into place, one after another, faster than I could hold them. The wine, he hadn't misremembered anything. He'd taken it himself, probably to her, probably to some version of a life he was already living without me. And then he'd looked me in the eye and told me I'd finished it. He wasn't confused. He was testing whether I'd push back. The conversations I couldn't remember. I hadn't forgotten them. They'd never happened with me at all. He'd had them with himself, rehearsing, or with her, and then folded them into our history like I'd simply lost track. Even the neighbor's statement made sense now. She hadn't lied. She'd described something real. A fight Corvin had started with me, deliberately, in plain view of her window, on a day I was already upset about something I can't even remember now, and barely holding it together with groceries in my arms. He hadn't been losing himself over months. He'd been living this second life for almost 2 years already, quietly, patiently, with the exact same stillness that made me fall for him in the first place. That's the part I still can't fully get past. The thing I loved about him was the thing he used to do it. For months I told myself a story about my own failure. I told you some of it already. The exhaustion, the distance, the way I made myself smaller instead of asking harder questions. I believed, all the way down, that somewhere in my own tiredness I had let something precious slip through my hands. That if I'd been more present, more attentive, things might have gone differently. I need to tell you, that story was wrong. Not incomplete. Wrong. Because here's what Wendell's photographs and Philippa's records eventually forced me to face. Corvin had started planning his exit before Iris turned 2. Before the distance I blamed myself for ever had a chance to grow. Before the exhaustion, before the long stretches alone with a newborn, before any of the moments I spent replaying and rewriting in my head, wondering what I could have done better. He had already decided. He had already met Tatum. He had already begun the slow, patient work of making me look like a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own daughter. The drift I felt so guilty about wasn't the cause of what happened to us. It was the result of it. It was what it feels like to be slowly erased from someone's life while he's still standing in your kitchen, drinking your coffee, asking how your day was. I spent over a year mourning a marriage I thought I'd let die through neglect. What I actually needed to grieve was something else entirely. The fact that I had built a life with someone who was performing love rather than living it, from a point earlier than I can even stand to think about. There's a difference between failing at love and being deceived by someone who studied you closely enough to know exactly what would make you stop asking questions. I spent so long believing I was guilty of the first thing. I was actually the target of the second. There was more in that storage unit than photographs of an affair. Once Philippa secured the right paperwork, investigators went through financial records that didn't belong to Corvin's firm at all. A forensic accountant spent weeks on what they found. For nearly a decade, Corvin had been redirecting money from infrastructure projects. Money meant for roads, water systems, projects designed to reach communities that needed them most. He'd been moving portions of it into private accounts and quietly shifting the money offshore, year after year, long before I ever met him. The firm had started an internal audit. Federal investigators were already circling something they couldn't fully name yet. Corvin knew it was only a matter of time. And a man who's about to lose everything starts looking for an exit, a story that lets him walk away clean, with sympathy on his side, instead of suspicion. That's what I was supposed to be, the unstable ex-wife, the cautionary tale that made him look like the responsible one, the safe one, the parent any court would choose. And Iris. I have to say this plainly, because softening it would be one more excuse. Iris wasn't an afterthought in his plan. She was the plan. Primary custody of a young child, a new partner waiting in a city no one would think to look twice at, a fresh start, funded by money that was never his to take. He needed her with him for the story to work. Our daughter was a prop in his exit strategy. I still have trouble saying that sentence out loud, not because I doubt it. I don't, not anymore, because some part of me will always wonder how I shared a bed with a man capable of looking at his own child that way and feeling nothing close to what a father is supposed to feel. I don't stand here today with all of this figured out. I have Iris. I have Philippa, who fought for 6 months straight without ever once making me feel like a burden. I have Wendell, who found what needed finding. I have a therapist, Dr. Okonma, who has sat with me through nights I didn't think I'd get through. And I have more hard-earned understanding about trust than I ever wanted to own. Here's some of it. The parts I'm still learning to carry. Stillness isn't the same as safety. I learned that one the slow, expensive way. A person can be calm and patient and attentive and still be using all of it against you. So now I ask myself a different question when someone makes me feel deeply seen. Are they seeing me or are they studying me? The answer shows up in what they do with what they find. I learned that my body knew things my mind refused to read. Every time I felt that small twist of unease and talked myself out of it, I had a reason ready. I was tired. I was paranoid. I was making something out of nothing. I had good reasons for all of it. But the feeling kept showing up anyway, and I should have asked it what it knew instead of arguing it down. I learned that making excuses for someone is just a slower way of avoiding what it costs to see clearly. I understand why we do it. Clarity is expensive. It costs you the story you've been comfortable inside, but staying inside the wrong story costs more. It costs you years. It nearly cost me my daughter. And I learned, the hardest way, that love should never make you doubt your own memory. I'll say that one again, because I needed someone to say it to me a year ago. A person who loves you doesn't make you feel unstable for noticing what's right in front of you. If someone in your life keeps making you question what you saw or heard or felt, that isn't love showing up quietly. That's control, wearing a kinder face. The last thing took me longest to accept. I am not responsible for what someone else built in the dark, long before I ever knew to look. Corvin pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges a little over a year after those papers landed on my kitchen table. He's serving 7 years now. Tatum cooperated with investigators in the end, and most of the money was eventually recovered, though no number ever quite covers what it actually cost. Iris is 7 now. She still has his eyes, and most days I've made peace with that, because they're hers too, and she is entirely her own person. She asks me enormous questions at bath time, and small ones over breakfast, and she feels safe. That's the thing I fought for. That's what mattered. I won't tell you the anger is gone, or that the grief has a finish line. It doesn't. It just changes shape. But I'm not the woman standing in her kitchen anymore, holding cold coffee, wondering if she's losing her mind. I know my own mind now. I trust it more than I ever trusted the version of him I spent so long protecting. If any part of this found you tonight, if you saw some piece of yourself in the doubt, or the excuses, or the moment I finally believed what I already knew, stay with me. Subscribe, and let's keep choosing honesty over comfort, one story at a time.